Today marks 100 days since protests for Breonna Taylor began in Louisville. And more protests are expected in the days ahead as calls continue statewide for the 3 officers involved in her fatal shooting to be arrested and charged. Meanwhile, State Attorney General Daniel Cameron has yet to release information regarding the investigation into Taylor's death. So with us now for more on this is Tessa Duvall. She's a reporter for the Courier-Journal in Louisville. Thank you so much for joining us again, Tessa. So first off, take us through the last 100 days. What should we take away from these protests so far? What are local leaders looking to do and to achieve?
Absolutely. So it's worth noting that Breonna Taylor died well over 100 days ago. She was killed on March 13th, but protests didn't begin until May 28th. So as you mentioned, today is the 100th day. And what really started as a protest very focused on Breonna Taylor has since evolved into a protest that is talking about police reform, is talking about gentrification, about food insecurity and education, and all of these things that really are affecting the Black community in Louisville. You know, it's become a fight that is about more than just Breonna Taylor. It is about racial justice and police reform, and is really, like I said, just gone beyond Breonna Taylor herself and beyond just getting charges for these officers.
So let's take a look at the case itself. Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, held a press conference earlier this week. He's filed a lawsuit against the Louisville Police Department, and he is alleging police misconduct. He says that the police are using him to cover up their mistakes. How does Walker's version of that night fit with the LMPD, and why did police arrest him?
Absolutely. So we learned more this week about Kenneth Walker. So we know it is not disputed that Kenneth Walker did fire a shot from inside the apartment the night that Breonna died. Now, what is newly being disputed by the attorney for Kenneth Walker in his civil suit is that Kenneth's gunshot may not have actually hit Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly. That is a new point being argued by his attorney, that perhaps this officer was hit by friendly fire because other officers on scene were firing from so many different angles very haphazardly, and that Kenneth Walker's shot did not hit him. So that is something new that we've heard coming out of this press conference with Kenneth Walker. And it's also worth noting that, you know, he's alleging some misconduct on the part of the officers, that, you know, one told him it was unfortunate that he wasn't hurt, that they threatened to let the dog loose on him, that they told him he was going to prison for the rest of his life, things like this, that he was mistreated in the aftermath of all of this.
And then we have Jamarcus Glover, right? And there was some reporting that suggested that he had been offered a plea deal if he gave Breonna Taylor's name, suggested that she was somehow involved. Now, I know there was a response to that he was not actually offered the plea deal, that it was just something that was floated. But what do we know about this exchange with police? What are both sides saying about this alleged offer?
Absolutely. So Jamarcus Glover is Breonna Taylor's ex-boyfriend, and he is essentially her connection to this entire case. So the reason that police went to Breonna Taylor's apartment in the first place is that they said they believed that Jamarcus Glover was sending packages, sending drugs to her apartment, that cash was being held there. And so this plea deal, which, as you mentioned, is being disputed by the two sides here, this plea deal form that Jamarcus Glover was offered would have listed Breonna Taylor as a co-defendant. And since then, the Commonwealth Attorney's Office has come out and said, you know, she was never a co-defendant. That was merely a draft of this document. Whereas Jamarcus Glover, in an interview with one of my colleagues, said why did they ask me to sign a draft? If it's a draft, why did you want me to put my name on it? And so there are, like you mentioned, there is a dispute between these two parties about, what that document was really intended to do. But we do know that the final plea offer that was sent to Jamarcus Glover and was released to the news media by the Commonwealth Attorney's Office removed her name as a co-defendant, but still would have required him to admit that he was using her apartment for shipments. And so it still would have connected her, but it did not mention her by name.
Okay. The nearly 40-page LMPD report was released just a couple of weeks ago. The 8-page investigative summary was also released. What stood out to you the most in both of these documents?
Absolutely. So what we saw in these documents were how LMPD connected Breonna Taylor to this overall operation. Now, a lot of this was done after the fact. So this leaked report that you mentioned was put together after Breonna's death. It uses jailhouse phone calls that Jamarcus Glover and others made that mentioned Breonna after she died. So we know this is not evidence that could have been used to get the search warrant, because these calls were made after she was dead, after they had already tried to serve the warrant. In addition to this investigative report, one of the things that really stood out to my colleague and I is that the officer who wrote it, Detective Joshua James, is the officer who got the search warrant for Breonna's apartment and the other houses connected to the investigation that night. And in this report, he writes that it was actually Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly who checked in with the Postal Service about if Breonna was getting suspicious packages or not. But yet in the affidavit for her apartment search warrant, he wrote that he checked in with the Postal Service. And so those both can't be true. It can't be true in the investigative report that Mattingly checked in, but in the affidavit be true that, James, the affiant himself, checked in. Like, one or the other is true, but they're not both true.
Right.
So that really stood out to us. Additionally, we learned how much manpower they have put into going after Jamarcus Glover. He was hit with search warrants in December. He was hit with search warrants in March. And then they hit his house again in April. So, in the span of 5 months, we've seen them execute multiple no-knock search warrants going after this guy. And based on what they find, he just seems to be a mid-level drug dealer.
It certainly seems like the more we learn, the more questions there are. The Attorney General still has not made a decision about whether or not to charge the officers involved. Has the Attorney General explained what is taking so long for him to come to a decision?
Well, he has repeatedly said that he wants this to be a thorough investigation. We just recently learned that he's gotten the ballistics back from the FBI, which is one of the last major pieces of evidence. So with that, having been done, we do expect that there could be a decision fairly soon in the next couple of weeks ahead. He's not saying when, but it seems reasonable that if that was one of the last pieces of evidence that he was waiting for, that we should be getting some kind of resolution as far as state charges go. But it's also important to remember that the FBI still has a case on Breonna Taylor's death as well.
Tomorrow's the Kentucky Derby. Can we expect protests at the Kentucky Derby?
Oh, yes. This is going to be a Kentucky Derby unlike the state has ever seen. So not only are there not going to be spectators and the fans, it's a September Derby. There are going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of people protesting all kinds of different coalitions. There are going to be people who are pro-police who are out there. There are going to be people who are protesting Breonna's death out there. It is going to be a very chaotic and busy day in Louisville with a lot of people out there, a lot of people taking to the streets. Traffic is going to be blocked off in certain areas. We've seen arrests at protests in the past, so we are prepared for it to be a very busy day tomorrow.
Well, the protesters are certainly putting the pressure on those in power. But I got to tell you, Tessa, you and your colleagues, the work that you are doing, demanding accountability, I think it's really exceptional and really, really needed in this case. So, Tessa Duvall, thank you so much.
Thank you.